Firstly, everyone, welcome to Phayul Perspective series. We are in conversation with Bhuchung Sonam. He is a poet and writer who co-founded the publication Tibet Writes, an imprint of Blackneck Books. He was recently honored with the Astana Prize for his writing and translations. Bhuchung was born in Tibet, and when he came to India, he studied at Tibetan Children's Village in Dharamshala, and later went on to pursue MA in journalism at Emerson College in Boston. Thank you so much for joining us today at Drung office.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. So let me first start off with Tibet Writes. Could you tell us how this idea of a publishing house came about, and why did you see the need to create a space for creative writers in the exile community?
Well, publishing house is a rather big word, I think.
No, but it is a publishing house, right?
Yeah, Tibet Writes started way back in 2003 with three friends. Tenzin, who most people, Tibetans would know, a writer, activist and writer, and one of our other friends, Tenzin, or Tenam, popularly known as, he was then the editor of Tibetan Bulletin. So three of us, we spoke about possibility of creating a website where Tibetans could at least put together all of our writings. I just published my book a year before, and Sundu has already published his Kora, I think maybe a year or two before I did. So we had a book each, but we knew a lot of other people who were writing, but who couldn't necessarily find a platform where they could, and a lot of other people also outsiders, they asked, where can we find a place where we can read Tibetan literature? So initially we started a website called Tibet Writes, and we discussed actually a lot about the name itself, whether we should call it Tibet Writes or whether we should call it something else. But in the end, we decided on Tibet Writes as to slightly in a more assertive mode, as to say Tibet Writes. So that's how it started. And then a year or two later, we also found that not only did we get a lot of submissions for the website, but we also had submissions from young Tibetans of 30, 40 poems. And it wasn't possible for a website to put everything online. So we thought, why not publish? Because I worked for Puljar publication a few years before, and so I had some experience of how the publishing industry works. So that's how we started Tibet Writes, and later we created our imprint called Blackneck Books, inspired by blackneck crane, the Tibetan bird that lives on the Tibetan plateau. So yeah, so we have published, I think so far maybe 45 titles.
Till now?
Oh. Till now, yes.
I see. So yes, I was going to ask you, the Tibet Writes has published a lot of unique titles over the years. So I wanted to ask, how do you choose your content, which content to publish or not? And more specifically, what do you look for in a manuscript?
Right from the beginning, we were very clear, secular Tibetan literature. That's what we wanted to focus, because we, as you know, the corpus of Tibetan Buddhist literature goes back 1300 years, and we already have a lot of publication regarding Tibetan literature on Tibetan Buddhist canons, both in English and of course in Tibetan. We had a really long history, so we thought that is by and large taken care of. But what was missing was the secular Tibetan literature, focusing on people's experience. For example, how does a young Tibetan write in a language that is not his own? So how does he negotiate his own sense of identity, and how does he assert these in a way that he feels, a way that he experiences every day? And that was what we thought was missing. And we also realized that we have, in the past 60 or so years, we have a lot of biographies, particularly by former geshes and monks and lamas, and also from former political prisoners. Right. But what was missing was, as I said, the secular literature, poetry, stories, novels. So this was what we wanted to focus on. And regarding how we choose, and see, there are not many Tibetan writers writing focusing on secular Tibetan literature. So whatever submissions we get, we have a loose network of Tibetan writers, both here in India and also elsewhere, particularly in the United States, from who we seek advices and guidances. and then we decide, if something is worth publishing or not.
Right. Okay. Thanks so much for that detailed, overview of how you work. So there's I wanted to ask you, since we're talking about content, there's a new title being published by Tibet Writes, a translation by Kunchok Raptin called Mutik.
Mutik.
Yeah, I wanted to get it right. So it is a translation of John Steinbeck's The Pearl. So this is a translation from an English text to a Tibetan language text. So if I may, I think this is a step by you to encourage Tibetan writers to translate from English to Tibetan rather than vice versa, because I've heard you speak about this a lot of times. How we tend to translate more from Tibetan to English rather than English to Tibetan. So could you tell us why do you think that this sort of writing is important than what we have been doing until now?
Translation, I think, throughout history has been incredibly important, because if you look at Tibetan history, for example,
right.
The entire corpus of Buddhist corpus that we have, the Buddhist literature, the entire Ganyu Dengyu, were basically the translation projects beginning in the 7th century till about 1959. So for all of these centuries, Tibetan masters, they dedicated their lives and limbs and everything basically with the support from kings and rich people. So basically, whatever that we have, we are really proud of the Buddhist heritage. It's because of the translation project that happened for many centuries. But in the last 60 years, the things have been on the other side. There have been a lot of translation projects of Buddhist texts into English, into Chinese and other languages. But we haven't had equal amount of translation of secular literature, particularly novels and poetry and science. And there's been a whole lot of actually global literature to be translated into Tibetan, and that hasn't happened. Anyamajin Institute probably was the only institute which focuses on translation of global literature into Tibetan language. Started many years ago, but of late, I think Gyawang Kamaba, he commissioned 108 titles, but they are all not necessarily works of literature. So what we thought was, now it's really important, if our language is to survive, then it is really important for us to make sure that we have enough literature in our language. And only way to do this is through now inward translation from other languages, particularly English into Tibetan. And Mutik is one title that we are really proud of. And Kunchok Raptin has done an incredibly good quality translation of John Steinbeck's short book, The Pearl.
You have also, I think, worked on Burning the Sun's Braids, the collection of poems that you had translated. Could you talk about that process a little bit? How it worked out?
This is the other way around. I also had a lot of internal conflicts and confusions about whether I should go on with this translation project of anthology of writers from inside Tibet. But in the end, I decided to go ahead with it because simply because we needed Tibetan writers from inside Tibet, writing in Tibetan, to be known first and foremost to our readers, Tibetan younger generation of Tibetans growing up here in India and also in the West increasingly since 1990s when Tibetan immigration to the West started. So we have this 4th and 5th generation of Tibetan growing up in the West who may not have access to Tibetan literature written in Tibetan. So for them, particularly, I started this translation because without this bridge of translation, without knowledge of what is happening inside Tibet, particularly how the intellectuals are handling the occupation and everyday torture and harassment and imprisonment. So I think this, I thought, was really important. So this was why I anthologized works of 13 Tibetan poets from inside Tibet. but I've never got in touch with any one of them for reasons we know best.
Yeah. You support a lot of emerging writers, but we know that there are very few internationally renowned writers. I think the best example we have right now in the recent past is We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies by Lamala. What do you think? So, given that that we are not able to produce writers such as not just Sri but like another Bhuchung Sonam. So, I mean, not to praise just you, but what about the culture that we have right now of writing and reading? We generally have we have a smaller community, reading community in exile. I don't know if you agree with that, but what do you think are the requirements for creating a culture where writers and publishers could thrive and maybe make a living out of?
Oh, it's a really big question.
I mean, what do you think could be done?
A reading habit, I think, is really important, and I've often said this. Maybe it has something to do with the how, for generations, we treated the Buddhist texts, for example. Buddhist texts are considered as something really holy and precious. They're always somewhere up there to be, to be respected, to be venerated, but never to be open and read and debated and discussed. So we, for generations, I think it is a culture, community culture that if there is a book particularly written in Tibetan, you kind of put it on a higher altar, higher level, and then kind of bow down and respect and not really become intimate with the book. And this, I think, culture may still continue, because in whenever I go to a Tibetan house, for example, I look at the bookshelves and particularly the books, and there, by and large, books are always somewhere up there, maybe just below the altar or somewhere where children can't really reach. And this really physical and emotional distance is might, I think, communally hamper our intimacy with the books. But of course now with the emerging generation, we don't really have that. And I remember when I was very young, we used to get People's Daily magazine, newspaper written in Tibetan. So whenever altar people there find pieces of Penjong Nyeri Tsapar on the pavement, they would pick it up because it's written in Tibetan. They put it on their forehead and put it on a higher level. So the respect for the text is such that it really kind of gives you away from in many ways. This is at least my personal observation. So I think, but things are changing. I think is one of the good example is one of our anthologies that we published recently.
The
Under
Reader,
the Blue Sky. Under the Blue Sky, we sold 1,000 copies in 45 days, I think. The second, we reprinted. We did a second reprint, and it is doing really well. And very happily, many of the people who ask for these books are, by and large, young Tibetans. So we see a change in there. But we still need support, because translation project, for example, from global literature to Tibetan, we hardly have any grants, for example, for translation. Whereas there are so much money poured into translating from Tibetan to English. We have a whole lot of money, both by the institution, monasteries, and individuals. But we don't really have much support for translation of global secular literature into Tibetan. So, and if we have all of these together, then I think we might see a good day for
culmination
sun
together.
and shine for Tibetan literature.
I agree with that observation. So there's a general idea that artists, particularly writers, that they need to be isolated, or they need to be egoistic to succeed in their body of work. But in our context, the Tibetan context, it's different, because we are writing about exile, and being and are in exile. I remember you also asked Tenzin, the artist, at his recent exhibition, where how the individual thing also, gets informs your art. So what do you think of that idea? And I want to pose the same question to you now. Do you think your individualism informs the art that you create?
Because see, creative art is a very dynamic process, and it is so because it involves each individual experience. Without lived experience, then art becomes really kind of a dry thing. Then you only go for art's sake, which for at least for people like us, we can't afford to do that. We must make art part of who we are, and if we are to do that, then the best way to do is to make sure that your own personal experience, whether it's things that you witness, whether things that you dream, whether things that you do or hear or see or feel, these come into your work, whether you're making a film or you're making a piece of painting, or whether you're writing a poem or a short story. I think that's really important, because without your individual part and involvement in the process, then I don't know if we can really do it, because unlike politics and religion, art, creative art is a dynamic process. It has to change all the time, and people change all the time, right? I am not what I was. I'm every time I'm a new person. So if I can make use of who I am every day, then art becomes a life thing. So I think for each individual, I think this is really important, because if you look at recent Tibetan history, for example, because we didn't really consider everyday experiences of ordinary people, we don't even have much stories from early decades in exile. People who work in the road building, for example.
Right.
Many of them worked decades building roads, but we don't have any stories, any concrete works of art dealing with these. We don't even have, I've been trying to find a spade, for example, used by the early road builders. We don't even have things like that. So I think we forget history because we neglect ordinary Tibetan experience, ordinary experiences. And if we are to make sure that history is taken care of, our narrative is to be taken care of, our creative art becomes dynamic, then it is really important to make sure that you are involved in the process.
Your individual voice.
Yeah.
So Bhuchung, we also mentioned that you won the Astana Prize. You also visited Italy to receive that prize. Could you talk to us? Could you tell us how that journey was like and what it was like, getting a prize like Astana?
I was very surprised, actually. I didn't really know what Astana Prize was initially, because I was in. Someone from Astana actually got in touch with me saying that, asking me for my short bio and a photo. Then about a week later, I got a letter saying that I got the Astana Prize, and I never really thought I deserve it, because I don't because the prize was for actually promotion, writing in mother tongue and promotion of mother tongue literature, which I don't know. I don't think I do much in that front. But the fact that they are recognized Tibetan is something, I think. When I went there, and then there was a lot of focus on minority language, including Tibetan, and the earlier recipient one of them was an American who works in Navajo nation. So we have, I think Astana Prize was instituted in 2008, and they focus on people who either directly work with the mother tongue or who promote language literature in these literature related with the mother tongue. So I think so I was very happy in a way, because whatever little that I do, I don't really do for winning prize, but the fact that there was a recognition, and when I went there were a lot of focus and discussion on Tibet. And there were a lot of, I think I was told by the organizers that the Italy's major newspaper and radio station, they had a lot of discussions, roundtable discussions, and during the prize ceremony, there was a French scholar on Tibetan language who was invited from France to do a panel discussion with me on Tibetan language and culture and the status of Tibetan language inside Tibet today. So we had quite a fruitful events.
Right. Congratulations, yeah, on that front. Since you have published a lot of titles, you said 45, right?
Around 45.
Yeah. So as a publisher, we have as a modern, culture. As a person from younger generation, trying to absorb the modern culture, we've seen a change in the traditional, book culture, where we would talk about the first editions, and now we have transformed to digital platforms. Kindles and ebooks are now the priority of people reading culture. So as a publisher, do you see that change as a challenge to publishing books that you do in print, or do you see that as an opportunity for people in exile publishing creative writing? Yeah.
We are really such a small insect that it doesn't really matter. I mean, but we were clear right from the beginning that our primary focus is physical book, and this is because no matter how good a website is, it has its own shelf life. Once a website dies, then everything is gone. But basically, right? So people have no access. Whereas a physical book, even if it's a limited edition of say 500 copies, you still find, if you know the title, one way or another, if the book exists physically, then you have access to it, right, whether in a library or somebody's collection. So I think we were very keen to make sure that all of our books are available in physical form. And unless people ask for soft copies, we don't really we have not opted for Kindle and not because we don't really want to, but we are stuck with the technicalities, because we don't really want to join Amazon, because Amazon is such a cannibalistic thing. We get distribution and access to a lot of market, so to speak, but we don't really want to be part of the whole machine that churns out things, and we wanted to make sure that at least, because we really have a unique voice, and so far I think we have done well, because we see Tsundu Skora, we are doing I think 16th edition, we sold 45,000 copies, and we sold some other copies. We did 2 reprint, 2nd reprint, 3rd reprint. So despite the fact that Tibet Writes is a really voluntary thing. We don't have any permanent office, we don't have any permanent staff, nothing. It's all voluntary basis, but despite that we still managed to do this. And I think strangely, sometime back I checked internet, and one of my book, a second book, a copy is being sold for $250
without your permission.
No. Okay. Somebody had a signed copy, and he has put this on eBay, asking for $250. Right. So kind of once you have the physical books, and so this idea of a first or a second or copy of the first print becoming a novelty is still, I think, very relevant to some extent. So, but anyway, so we see a change. I think increasingly people, especially in the West, they do ask for soft copies. So we might
transition.
Do the transition, sooner or later. I think it's important, because ultimately we are not here to make profit, because ours is a non-profit project. So more people read, whether it's in physical form or soft Kindle edition or EPUB or whatever. So I think as long as people have access, then it should be fine.
Yeah, I think on that note, I thank you very much for giving us your time. And I have a lot of questions, but I think because of the time constraint, we'll stop here. wish you luck with Tibet Writes and everything and more. Thank you so much, Bhuchung.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Yeah.